And when we were taken prisoner, that was part of what we were destined for, and that was our job, just as much as the boys that were killed at Tobruk and El Alamein and all the others. But as Australians did right through, we looked after each other, we worked out what was the right thing to do. Mind you, it showed fairly soon the loss of life didn't mean anything to the Japanese. If a man was going to die within a few hours, quite often he was made comfortable as much as they could under a bush or something, and they all said goodbye to him, and that was it. I think there were about 800 or 900 patients there. They were dying at anything up to 30 a day, so it was getting less and less. This general, who wasn't going to surrender, committed ceremonial harry on the drum in front of him. You know, we'll only be gone 12 months, this war's not going to last. And I was gone for nearly 6 years. Pointed out that it was the duty of every soldier to try and escape. As you say, books have been written about this. I think we marched for about 12 nights, and we did march for about 180 miles. Right, well, I was born in Kempsey on the Macleay River in New South Wales. Left school in year 10 as it was year 9 as it was in those days, intermediate certificate, and joined a real estate firm at Crow's Nest. Stopped there till I was 21, which took me through till about 1939. I'm 1917, yes, and I'd intended stopping in real estate right through. Well, of course, 1939, the war came along. My partner, who's, I say, a lot older than me, a First World War man, came to me and said, look, you've got itchy feet, haven't you? You want to join the army? I had been in the militia, which these days are called citizen forces. I'd been in that from 1937, so I'd done two and a half years. I was with 1st Division Signals at Crow's Nest. I was with a group of fellows, all of who'd been in 1st Division Signals with me, and we enlisted at Greta, taken to Newcastle Hospital for our checkup. My war service started in Singapore. We started at Kuala Lumpur, really. I went over with the 1st of the 8th Division, 8th Division Signals. We went on the Queen Mary. Thought and hoped we were going to the Middle East. We hadn't been informed, but nevertheless we were wondering because we'd been issued with tropical clothing. And so we were in a convoy of 4. The Queen Mary had the 8th Division boys. There was Aquitania, 2 or 3 others, New Amsterdam, and the Hobart warship escorted us. In the middle of the Indian Ocean, all the boats stopped, and we sailed round them, and the bands were playing on the others were saying goodbye to us, and we headed northwest to Singapore. Arrived in Singapore towards the end of February, and detrained there, off the boat there, and then headed for Kuala Lumpur. We did our training in jungle training, rubber plantations and the other things, till about the end of September, when word was coming through that probably the Japanese would come in, the knowledge we were getting. So we continued to train then in Johor Bahru, which is the state nearest to Singapore. We dispatch riders, our main training, we were all pretty experienced blokes from our previous 1st Division Signals. Our main training, of course, was map reading, getting to know Malaya, which we did thoroughly. I got to love Malaya too. It's a beautiful country, particularly when you can disappear from the camp on your bike and they don't know when you'll be back. We did a lot of that, of course. And so we were there until the night of the 8th of December, when we heard planes overhead. We counted them, and they used to come in flights of 27, and the bombing started on Singapore. There was no declaration of war, of course, as you probably well know. They did Pearl Harbor and Malaya and Hong Kong, the whole lot. So we went into action there. Our main period of action for the first month or so was being bombed and in and out of Singapore with dispatches. But then by the middle of January, the Japanese had come down Malaya all the way down. The British forces and Indian forces were doing the first early fighting, but it was a losing battle from the beginning because literally we had no planes really. We had a handful of planes, but there were no match whatsoever for the Zeros, for the Japanese planes. And the other thing, we had didn't have one single tank, and of course the Japanese came down the roads in tanks. We had a few pretend tanks. As a matter of fact, when our early training in KL in Kuala Lumpur, we went over to Port Swettenham on the coast and thought, look at these wonderful tanks we've got. You could see them in the parks in the distance. Rode our bikes up to them and they were 3-ply and painted as though they were tanks. So a lot of people don't realise, I think, just how impossible it was to defend against the Japanese army, because what we found, we have no criticism, quite frankly. People said after we came home, and still right is right, that Britain abandoned us and so on. That wasn't the case at all. The case was this, that Britain was fighting a lone action against the Germans till the Americans came in, and the first priority, and we knew this, had to be Europe. If Europe went over and the Japanese were joining, we knew they would join with them, and we did join with them, there would have been no defence of Australia, no defence of India, no defence of anywhere. So Mr. Churchill did exactly the right thing. We weren't abandoned, that was our job. We did it to the best of our ability. And we again, what a lot of people don't realise, a division is 3 brigades. 20-odd thousand men. There were only 2 brigades in Malaya. The rest were Darwin, Amboy, Timor and so on. So really it was a foregone conclusion what was going to happen. But you won't find any of the 8th Division blame Britain at all, because, as I say, the first thing had to be, and I mean, they had no ships to get us off and so on. So all that happened to us was we ran out of land. We ran out of land, and when we were taken prisoner, that was part of what we were destined for, and that was our job, just as much as the boys that were killed at Tobruk and El Alamein and all the others. We would have loved to have been in the Middle East with them, but there it goes. So that was up till, as I said, when we landed, when we went into action. The action, I've said, was a foregone conclusion that we would be prisoners of war. I spent the first 18 months not in Changi. We were all taken to Changi. We marched, as you've no doubt read, 20 miles out to Changi and carried what we could. And food was scarce, everything was scarce. But I was in and out of Changi because Japs had us out on working parties to clean up Singapore and do jobs for them and unload ships and so on. Anyhow, we got round to 1943. I'd kept in reasonable health. I was losing weight, as everyone else was, continually. In early 43, word came through that the Japanese were going to take a large number of us north. What they told our officers was that we were going literally to a place of milk and honey, and where health was better and everything would be wonderful. And they told our officers to include even semi-fit men. That didn't matter because they'll do well when they get up there. On about the 20th of April 1943, 7,000 were allotted to go to Thailand, known as F Force, 3,500 British, 3,500 Australians. I was on, we went on trains at one day between each train. When we got down to Singapore railway station, there lined up were rice trucks, as we found, like our wheat trucks, steel trucks, Japanese herded by belting everyone and so on to get into the trucks, 27 to a truck, and away we went. The 27, we realised the moment we got in to steel trucks what it was going to be like, but as Australians did right through, we looked after each other, we worked out what was the right thing to do, and the right thing we found quite quickly was 9 could lie down and have a rest, while the 18 others, and we did that in breaks of 4 hours. As far as food was concerned, it averaged about 2 so-called meals a day. It was what we called rice pap, which was watery rice. But nevertheless, we'd got fairly used to that in Singapore, so we got it. As far as hygiene was concerned, it didn't exist. We found rather quickly that the best hygiene was to push the door open and hold your mates, and away it went. And it worked, and we got through. Unfortunately, of course, and inevitably, it took 5 days and 5 nights to get up there. But the train stopping constantly, and the heat was unbearable, and there were a lot of men who got ill on the trip up who never really recovered, who were amongst the early fatalities on the line because they'd been sick on the way up and there was no medical attention to really. Our own doctors were absolutely fantastic, but they had practically nothing because the Japanese again had not allowed to take anything except a small suitcase, and but also the Japanese were, not that we believed them, but assured everyone that there'd be tons of medical supplies up there. So at the end of 5 days, we arrived in Thailand at Ban Pong. It was a very small place then, a little native village type. There was one fairly large at-up hut there, which they put us in when we arrived for the overnight and told us we'd be moving the following morning. When we looked at the at-up hut, it was in the foulest condition you could possibly imagine. There'd been poor old natives in it who'd been taken up to work on the line. They had no organisation, no where we had our officers or a few officers with us, where we had a doctor with us or 2 doctors with us. They had nothing. We didn't get any sleep because we very quickly said we're going to clean this place up, and it took us all night to do it. But it was done cheerfully because we did it because our mates were coming up the next day and the next day, and so it went on. A lot of people contracted in my first group. A lot of people. By the way, the train carried about 700 people, and a lot of our people contracted their first really bad dose of dysentery through the conditions there. We were lined up the next morning outside to be told what was going to happen. The Japanese interpreter came along and he said, travel fairly light, leave anything heavy here because you're going to now march through the jungle for 180 miles to the Burmese border. And the condition the blokes were in, the fellows were in, you know, we were a bit taken aback, to say the least, but nevertheless, our friends, the Japanese, we only marched overnight because the Japanese wouldn't march in the heat of the daytime. Just before we moved up, we were introduced to a doctor who was going to go with us. And he was a big, gangling, rosy-cheeked fellow. He looked about 18 or 19. And I can remember somebody near me saying when we were laying up, God, we've got a boy for a doctor. How is he going to handle this? At the end of 12 days and 12 nights, we had one of the greatest men in the world. He was absolutely fantastic. Dr. Roy Mills, who's been written up quite a bit. I bet that he was a personal friend, but he was a personal friend to the whole 600 or 700. That doctor had to look after 6, and where they marched us to, we weren't anywhere near the other 6,000 odd of there that had a lot of medical things, like Dr. Coates, Weary Dunlop, all those. This young man, who was just the reason he looked like he did, he'd only been out 6 months as a doctor here in Australia, in Newcastle, and but he turned out the most fantastic man. He died last year, and he's an honorary member of our association, my Signals, but he was just, and he was indicative of the other medical men up and down the line. So away we went, and by the way, by coincidence, the day we set out to do the march after arriving from Singapore was Anzac Day, 1943. We had a bugler, and as we start to straggle through the night, and it used to spread out 4 or 5 kilometres with fellows dropping out and the mates helping them. And the old bugle used to do at 3 o'clock in the morning, he'd start to play It's a Long Way to Tipperary. He died on the railway, by the way. But so we marched for 12 days or 12 nights, and so-called rest in the day, but typical of the Japanese. As soon as we'd get in anything from 6 o'clock in the morning till the last of them at 10 or 11, Japanese immediately called for working parties to look after them, and so there wasn't much rest. You were, when you were marching really in your sleep a good deal of the time. You can imagine then the condition that a lot of people were at the finish. But the day after we hit the spot where we were, where there was no camp, nothing, a few tarpaulins and so on, and they had us out in the line working straight away. Stupid people, the Japanese, in this direction. If they'd fed us reasonably and a bit of medicine, so on, we would have done a far better job on the railway than. But that's there. Mind you, it showed fairly soon the loss of life didn't mean anything to the Japanese. And I've got to say now that probably most of us have partly forgiven, but we haven't forgot. We don't believe the Japanese have changed. We've got hatred out of us because you can't live with hatred. But by Jove, we haven't forgotten. And so we set to work. That would be April, early May we were working, and we were in this area away from the other group, but then in the general area of the line, and we were moved from spot to spot. The monsoon set in straight away, so the weather poured and rained for months, and of course cholera arrived, people and fellows start to die from ill treatment, and if you fell out with a lot of the Japanese and did something that really upset them, it could be your death warrant, because how you were knocked about, you didn't recover. That's the point. So we learned pretty quickly to what Australians hate and would hate still is what some of the Japanese and Koreans started off was slapping your face, and the average Australian, and particularly some of the tough country boys and so on, slap in the face, and they'd throw a punch at the Japanese guard. Well, that was signing your death warrant just about too. I don't need to say much about the treatment because it's part of history now. Everyone knows it. Koreans, we were inclined to disliked the Koreans more than we did the Japanese. Because the things they did, as I say, were petty things, such as slapping the face and odds and ends. The Japanese, they didn't mess around with that. They went right into what they were doing. And when I came home, I was not ashamed, but I changed and we all changed just about our thoughts about the Koreans, because history told us when we came home that those Koreans had been POWs for 40 years. The Japanese took Korea over in the early 1900s, and these people, the Japanese had used them as slaves in Japan. And these young fellas, they'd been brought up that way. And so I began to think, well, how would we be if we'd had 40 years? And the Koreans, of course, when they were given their freedom, it all came out then. So we don't blame the Koreans at all. They were just very unfortunate people. Yeah, so our group on the work was mainly on cuttings, or partly on some of the bridges and so on. So we weren't at Hellfire Pass. We were on a cutting just below that, a big one for about 4 months. The line was joined, as you know. There were Australians coming in from the Burma, and they were A Force. They were the first to go up, and F Force was after them. In between was several B Forces that went to Borneo, and of course none of them came back. They were at Sandakan, and that was it. But by the end of October, just over 6 months, May, June, July, August, yes, just over 6 months, we met the boys from, they met us from the Burma end. So the line was joined then. Then we were doing maintenance work on it for a few weeks. And in that 6 months, out of my group, the group we were on of 7,000, the overall, 3,500 were dead. So it was about 50%. The figures are quite well known. 2 point something British forces and 1 point something Australian forces. I know why our death rate was less. If ever I hear anyone knocking mateship, they don't know what they're talking about. We would have had 2,500 dead too, but fortunately the Australian mateship was there, and we sort of consciously or unconsciously from the first day onwards ended up in little groups of 6 or 7 mates, and if one was in trouble, the other 5 or 6 looked after him. No Australian I never saw an Australian left to die on his own, never. And even though the chaps knew they were going to die, the mere fact that they were with their mates and looked after the end, the British didn't have that mateship to the same extent, and they were realistic. Talking to them, they said they were realistic. If a man was going to die within a few hours, quite often he was made comfortable as much as they could under a bush or something, and they all said goodbye to him, and that was it. And the Dutch, they went a step further, and again the Dutch were made up mainly of Indonesians, as they are now, with Dutch officers. And they literally, if a fellow dropped when they were moving, they'd walk over him. But that was their attitude too. And we felt desperately sorry for the natives of those countries. Not just for that, but they had no organisation, they didn't have the doctor angle that we had, and so on. So, as I said, mateship is very alive and well, I think, and does a wonderful job. We got word about the end of November, that our group were going back to Singapore. We're not quite sure. We thought we'll probably go back the way we came. However, most of them, our group, were taken into Bangkok and put on a ship and taken down by boat on a cargo ship. However, a hospital, so-called hospital, was set up at Kanchanburi, at Kamburi as we called it, and we had an officer in our unit, again who was a great man, Captain Ben Barnett. Ben Barnett was vice captain to Bradman in the 1938 tour. He was absolutely a number one man. He worked side by side with Roy Mills. At any rate, they were setting up a hospital for the people that they knew would die in any case, as they kept coming down. Again, a so-called hospital. It was just some atap huts with no proper drainage but there was at least food could be obtained down there to a certain extent, and we would get eggs and things like that. So Ben Barnett volunteered. They were calling for volunteers to stop and man the hospital for a few months, and Ben called for volunteers, and my group of mates, 6 or 7, we volunteered to stop with Ben. And we stopped there. As I say, there was at least some food around, but we were, I think there were about 800 or 900 patients there. They were dying at anything up to 30 a day, so it was getting less and less. And at least we could have a funeral service for them, and at least that we knew where. And of course that's why Kamburi today is the official war cemetery and beautifully kept. But we fellows worked there. There were some British group there. There were 2 British fellows who were found stealing drugs from the doctors and trading them. And we had a doctor there who was in charge really of that section, a major, and he was a wonderful man. And he lined these 2 up and lined the whole camp up, lined the 2 up, and he gave them a father and mother a belting in front of the lot of us, you know. But and the Japanese thought that was wonderful, you know, to see one of our own belting. Anyhow, you know, there was nothing more low than to start stealing medicine from the fellows who were dying. I was glad they weren't Australians, frankly, because there would have been some Australians who could be guilty of that sort of thing too. We didn't have saints all the time, of course. But so we were working away there. That camp, I know, saved my life, because when the death rate got down, we were there from November, I think, till the death rate got down to a pretty low number by February, early March. So what the doctors did, all of we workers were given an absolute thorough medical examination. One of the big killers was cardiac beriberi, which is heart beriberi, as you know. When you got cardiac beriberi, you didn't get the swelling there, but it happened in the heart, and it was incurable, and if it went on, you dropped dead. They were dropping dead around about. After my examination, I was put on a makeshift stretcher and carried into the hospital and laid down. The fellow next door to me, he was in my unit. He had cardiac beriberi, and the second day I was there, he leaned over for something and just went bang. The only treatment was complete rest and to try and get a bit of vitamin B, and we were able to get a bit of vitamin B supplements in some of the food they were able to buy. What they did, the officers everywhere, they pooled their pay, which was more than ours, and spread it through the lot of us. We sent ours in 10 cents a day. We got, of course, and they got 25 and 35, so it all went in. Anyway, I'm sure it saved my life because I was given complete bed rest. I didn't drop dead. When we came to be moved, we found we were going back in the same rice tracks again. Unfortunately, some fellows died on the way down because we took the hospital, what was left of the hospital patients. We had, the Jap said, you're going to be more comfortable. Instead of 27, you're going to have 26. We looked at the rice trucks and they were smaller rice trucks than the ones we came up in. So they put one less man. Anyway, I was on a makeshift, the stretchers were made out of rice bags, and but I was laid down in the truck, and any of us on the stretchers, the boys reorganised themselves, so you were left there all the time. You didn't have to. You wanted to get up and stand up and take your turn, but you didn't. I was carried in after 5 days. A few died, unfortunately, on the way down. The trucks met us at Singapore airport. By the way, the favourite saying when we knew we were going back to Singapore, we all said we're going home. After where we'd been, Singapore sounded just as good as home to us, and particularly Changi. I mean, Changi was rough, but so different. When we were carried in, as a matter of fact, I was only reading recently how it happened. We had the Australian officer in charge was Blackjack Gallagher, as no doubt you know. He was CO of the 30th Battalion, which was one of our absolute best. And on F Force, 500 of his boys, between 500 and 600, were sent on F Force. When they were brought in by a truck, Blackjack was standing in the square in Changi to meet them, and his 2 IC did the usual thing. When they got out of the trucks, there was a Sergeant Major with them from the 30th. He said, "Now remember your soldiers, boys." Yes, he said, "Line up and march. Blackjack's there." And when these boys came into Blackjack's sight, as we all were, barefooted or feet bound up with bits of rag and whatnot, and G-strings and bones stretching out. I was 4.5 stone at the weighing in, and I was a working fit. Some of these 6-foot-odd fellas were under 4, you know. Anyway, they lined up. Those who couldn't march, their mates helped them in. Blackjack broke down and cried and cried. And that of course happened to all of us. I was carried in on this stretcher, and my own crowd were there. Ben Barnett was still Nick, he looked after us. I was carried in onto the square and laid down, and why I know it saved my life, 2 doctors came out to examine us. One was a chap called Billy Bye. Dr. Bye was a heart specialist. I often wondered when he sounded me because he was as deaf as a post, but he was a heart specialist. And the other was Dr. Cotter Harvey. He was the man who started the smoking. You know, he was a full colonel, and Billy Bye was a major. Both were examining. Got down on their knees and examined me. Then had a little talk, and Billy Bye turned to me and said, get up and go for a run, mate." And then he talked to me afterwards. He said, the doctor who had looked after me and put me on a stretcher was a chap called Bruce Hunt, who's very well known if you read it. He was a Western Australian doctor and a wonderful man. So getting put on a stretcher saved my life, I'm quite certain. Right, we were back in Changi. The boys and people who'd been in Changi right through. By the way, I, as I told you, arrived in Bampong on Anzac Day, so I was exactly a year, because the day I was carried in was Anzac Day 1944. So I was exactly 1 year, I had 2 Anzac Days. Anyhow, we'll never forget those the several thousand from the top officer down to all of us. pooled everything they'd scrounged and whatnot and gave it to us. Or gave it to the cook and so on. And within about 3 months, we were pretty good again. I wasn't ready to do very much. It took me, and a lot of us, took me from May through till nearly Christmas, I suppose. And the Japs then start to have some of us on working parties just in and out of Singapore first. And we liked that because you could get scrounge stuff while you were in there, particularly if you could get down to the wharves and so on, and take the risk of getting it back in, which you did just the same. Anyhow, right, that went on, and we settled down. Food got gradually worse and worse because the Japanese were beginning to feel it themselves, and the natives did. I went out to one working camp at a place called Luani Road, which was opposite the Royal Singapore Golf Course, and the back wire, barbed wire, was a Chinese cemetery, and it was the best place we were for a long while because there were funerals every day. And the Chinese, one of the things they do is when they bury one of their family, they leave food on the grave to see them into the new world. And we used to go under that wire every night. It rapidly got the name. We said we've been out and we got the death cake. But it was good. I think the Chinese knew, but they didn't worry. They probably felt, yeah, well, it's doing something for them. But the death cake was pretty good, I can tell you. But the Japanese were beginning to show signs that, we knew too. We had underground wireless sets, as you know, and we had the official one because Signals were the wireless people. Two of our fellows, two brothers, the Arthur boys, risked their lives, the whole of Changi, by tuning into the stations, taking the news to where it had to be taken, and then the officers would decide how far down it would go and how much. We're to early January 1945. Early in 1945, the Japanese called for a party of 500 men. We didn't know, they didn't tell us where we were going, but they told us that we'd have reasonable accommodation and that there was a job to be done. So we loaded on trucks in Changi, and we arrived at a place called Bukit Panjang, which is one of the villages, or was at that stage one of the villages on the island, fairly close to Johor, fairly close to the Straits of Johor. And we had 2 or 3 huts which weren't too bad. We were marched out the next day. We were marched out to a rubber plantation. I think we had to march out each day about 3 miles, and back through Chinese villages. Got out there, working conditions weren't too bad. What we were doing, of course, and we protested, but the protests were always done knowing that we'd still have to do the job because they just stopped the food entirely for everyone if you didn't. And what we found that we were doing was building tunnels into the side of the hill. The Japanese used tunnels for defence purposes in New Guinea and Bougainville, everywhere, and you'd go in so many yards, as it was then, so many yards across and so many, and they were very effective for the chaps who were in action against Japanese who used the tunnels. They put what we would call a platoon, about 18 or 20 men in these, and we were digging these in because the Japanese were getting nervous that Singapore would be invaded. So we were digging away there from about middle of January, and working conditions were reasonable. Food was still very scarce, but we went ahead. usual thing though, the Japanese, as they did up on the railway, they started what we called hurry hurry. It was speedo, speedo, speedo. And they would not allow us to do safety measures that we wanted to do in the tunnels. We had two fellows in our group who'd been coal miners, and they knew exactly what to do. And over and over again, whoever we had out in charge with us, generally it was a sergeant or a corporal there, and they'd go and protest, probably get a smack across the face for protesting, but we did it all the time. We used to work for 10 minutes on the face, 2 men, and to do that for the Japanese tunnels, you were down on your hands and knees, you worked on the face, and 2 men carried baskets out with the soil. My closest mate, and he's still with me, and we started the march on Anzac Day saying we wouldn't finish, and we finished still. Johnny Parks and I, we had done our sprint on the face of 10 minutes, changed over, and 2 others of our mates took over. I'm damned if we just got out of the tunnel ourselves with the soil, and down she came at the back. And we missed it by 1 minute probably. At any rate, of course, everybody, hands and all, dug with you for anything you could lay your hands on. And Fred Wilson, one of our Western Australian boys, he was only 21 then, he was dead when we got him out. The other fellow we got out. Fortunately, very fortunately, there was a Jap NCO in there, and it broke his legs and knocked him about. And from the next day, we were allowed to do any safety measure we wanted to. And we were able to get a bit of timber from a sawmill. The Japs told us the Japs had a camp at a sawmill down the road. And we were able to get the stuff so there were no more falls. But of course, it took the injury to the Jap. He was an officer, but a non-commissioned officer. They have a rank in the Japanese army that comes in and in between, a little bit like our warrant officers. Anyhow, something fortunate happened to me, I suppose. Getting out, I had a bit of luck then. On this sawmill that they put in, where they wanted about 8 men to go to the sawmill, and Captain Stahl, who was an officer from our unit, and he was in charge of our 500, another fine man, and he was a South Australian. And I was put on this 8-man team, but he called me over and he told me why he was putting me on it. We were getting a truck out every day to our camp. He used to bring out some food or things from Changi to the camp. And Fred Stahl had a talk with the sergeant, come out, and he told him, we're going to, as long as this has been done, we're going to bring out the news from Changi camp to you. And Freddie Stahl called me in. I did have a pretty good memory in those days, and he knew this. And he said, what I want you to do, he said, where the news will come out to the sawmill. They're not going to risk bringing the news into the camp, but out to just to the sawmill where I'm not there and nobody's there who normally. And he said, whoever's bringing the news out, it'll be just half a dozen sentences. He said, link up with the fellow who's going to bring. He'll link up with you, he knows, and make some arrangements where you can take as little risk as possible to take the news, and little risk as possible to the fellow bringing the news, because if they got him and tortured him, it'd go back to Changi possibly, and finding the source of the news. At any rate, this chap came out. They had a different fellow from time to time, but we worked out a scheme. The Japs wouldn't allow us to use their toilet, and we had a toilet down in the bush just outside the sawmill area, and the sawmill area was a Japanese camp as well. So I became a sawmiller for a while, and we used to generally give a nod to each other. and I'd go down to our toilet and wait for a little while, and then he'd saunter down too. So I was the news carrier in the last couple of months, and it was interesting, naturally. I get the monosyllables, but came the day that he came in and he said, there's been some mighty explosions that have never been heard before. We're going to get some more tomorrow, but it sounds as though something fantastic has happened in Japan. And the next day he came and he told me that at the Hiroshima, the whole city had been flattened by one bomb. Never mentioned an atom bomb, because it wasn't mentioned. We didn't know what an atom bomb was in any case, but there's an enormous explosion. So I came back. What Fred Stahl used to do was I'd bring the news to him, then he'd decide the reliable sergeants or sergeant majors, and he, with the same, would also work out how much of that they would pass on, hold other for the time being till they knew. The third day, the atom bomb had dropped. There's no doubt about that, and also the first announcements of a surrender. And I think the Japs kept us going for about 6 or 7 days. The Working Party had digging the tunnels and us to the. But about the 4th or 5th day, as we were going through some of the Chinese villages walking past, the Chinese were jumping up at the V for Victory sign and whatnot, nothing else, and the Japanese attitude was beginning to really change. And finally, the Japanese, in some way or other, said that to Fred Stahl that there had been an agreement that the war would finish. Not that they'd lost the war, an agreement the war would finish, but he'd let them know more. At any rate, then the Chinese, by the way, were beginning to get bolder and get messages in, and it became, when we knew that there had been an official surrender, we were still out there, it was the worst 6 or 7 days as far as anxiety was concerned, because the Japanese general on Singapore Island had said he wasn't going to surrender, and he was come as but may, and they had 500,000 Japanese troops. Right, he said he refused to surrender, and he was going to fight on. Mountbatten did a very clever thing. Mountbatten was in Saigon at that stage, and the Tenohika, the Japanese emperor's nephew, was there, and he was a general. And Mountbatten had a talk to him, and this fellow flew down to Singapore, and as a relation of the emperor, he was over this general. So he ordered the general to surrender. He said he was taking over. He met him at the airport, at Changi Airport, and this general, who wasn't going to surrender, committed ceremonial hara-kiri on the drum in front of him. So he was going to carry on, there was no doubt about that. So that was about 8 days afterwards, and about 8 days after, the trucks arrived. And Freddie Stahl, by the way, we had a tailor in our camp, and Fred Stahl for 2 or 3 months had this fellow. He had us all looking out. I was able to get a bit of blue stuff from the Japanese camp that we're in, a bit of blue material, and smuggle it back. And bit by bit he got red, white and blue and whatnot, and he had an Australian flag. We pulled it up in the put it up in the camp. The Japanese, by the way, at this stage had vanished from our camp, and put it up there. And going back on the truck, we carried that back to Changi, and it was the first Australian flag at the gates of Changi that went up. And Fred had that up till 20 years ago, and it now is in the War Museum in Canberra, of course. So we were back to Changi. We were free people. The island was still a little bit dicky, and we were under orders for some days to stick in the camp. The first thing we saw were Catalinas start to come in and drop food. It was interesting what happened there too. The first lots of food that were dropped, bully beef and all this sort of thing, and we really thought this is great. And by God, we were sick men for a while. And all we wanted was more and more rice, strangely enough, because our stomachs hadn't settled down to it. And after a week or so, we all decided that we'd take our chances. We wanted to get into Singapore and down to the wharves because we knew that boats were coming in. And we were bumming lifts, on trucks, of course. And went into Singapore. The first lot I went with, again, my remaining 6 or 7 mates, we went in. And we went straight down to the wharf area. Down in the wharf area. Have you been to Singapore? No.
For a couple of days.
Well, if you went right into the city, the wharves are right there, and there's a beautiful little park there where, in the old days, they used to play test match cricket and so on, and tennis. Anyway, the day we went in, we could hear this noise terrific noise of shouting as we felt, and yells coming. It was from down onto this Padang, as it's called over there, the park, beautiful park. We got down there, and here's a whole line of Japanese POWs lined across this, and lined across them, behind them was a line of Chinese. And the Chinese, the Japs were there to clean up the park, and they were picking up papers and rubbish and whatnot, and the Chinese were behind them tearing up paper and dropping these. And in guarding them was a complete company of Gurkhas with their bayonets out. We stood there for a while watching, and then one of my mates said to me, "We don't want to continue to watch this, do we?" And I said, "No, I don't think we do." Yeah. I was very proud of the way our Australians behaved after we had said for years, naturally, we're going to get our own back when the time comes. Well, of course, when the Japanese took Singapore Island 3.5 years before, the way they behaved, they killed 30,000 Chinese in the first 3 or 4 weeks. There were heads on every pole around Singapore Island, severed heads of Chinese, and brutality going on all the time. We said we'll get our own back. We decided sort of collectively, we're not going to be like them. We just ignored the whole thing. I never saw an atrocity committed. Several instances that I knew of where, and I didn't blame the chap, went up and jobbed a Japanese who'd ill-treated him. Some of those who'd been in the Thai Utram Road jail and had been tortured for years. But there was never one thing from Australians collectively of what the Japanese, and I thought that was pretty good.
It's called the quits.
Yeah, so my party, my group, of course by this stage we were fattening up. We came back not looking the skeletons that we were, because you put on weight pretty quickly. Medical teams came in, of course. So we were on Singapore Island from August 1945, and we sailed about 2 months, 2.5 months, and we came back on 2 boats, the Largs Bay and the Esperance Bay. They were coastal passenger steamers, medical teams on them all. Yes, well, as I say, we arrived back that particular day. We were taken out to Cholera, where we were medically examined. Later on I had to go into hospital, we all had to for a while. I got home. Pat and I had known each other since, well, her school days, and I'd just left school days. She was at Willoughby High, I'd been down at North Sydney High. We'd seen each other around Chatswood, of course, got to know each other, and it went on, frankly. And when I was in the army up at Bathurst, we became engaged. So I said to her, you know, we'll only be gone 12 months, this war's not going to last. And I was gone for nearly 6 years. So, you know, I'm still here.
Doing very well.
No, only a handful of us still here. There's only about 13 of my whole 150 of the section I was in. But I'm 85. And when, even on Anzac Day, we're saying, why are we still here? We wonder why the heck some of us are still around.
Got great results.
Got to be lucky, that's all. people used to say to me when I came over at the railway, oh, you must have been fit, or you must have been this or that. You just had to be damn lucky, that's all. I had several of my best friends in the unit, who did marvellous jobs helping everybody on the railway, but they came to a stage where they said, I've had it, I don't think I want to carry on this. And if you said that, you died. There's no doubt about it. I believe you can point the bone at yourself. I don't think... Well, you could. We had one chap, Noel Chitty from Melbourne. He was a bachelor of 35, and he did a fantastic job. He carried blokes on the road. He was a big, strong fellow in his own day. And when things were at the worst on the railway, we were working up to 11 at night from 6 in the morning, and when the hurry was really on and the bastard monsoon was on, you were swamping your way back in, and we had a bit of a lean-to under a tree, and Noel was with us. He was one of our 6 or 7, and he came in this night about 11 o'clock, and he said, you can have my rice. He said, I'm not going to carry on. He said, there's no one at home, I'm not married. He said, there's no one at home that would worry too much about me. And what we used to do, if anyone said that, we'd beg them not to, and say, don't be silly, and then we'd abuse them. Really abuse them, tell them they were cowards, anything. You know. And sure enough, he lay down, he wouldn't eat his rice, and at 6 in the morning he was gone. You know. And he was what I often said, and others said too, I wouldn't have had the guts to do it. You had to fancy just having the guts to decide you're going to do that. So here it was. Yeah, so home, health wasn't very good. Malaria stuck with me for on and off for a year.
Did you ever expect that you'd be going to war?
No, not at that stage. But by I joined the militia about, as I told you, about sometime through 1936, I can't remember that. But I've got my discharge certificate that shows it. But by 1939, our training in the militia had been pushed up. So the powers that be were aware, and of course a war had started in 1939, at the end of 1939, so they were pretty right. So at the beginning, I'd say for the year before war actually broke out between Britain and Germany and France and Germany, I think by that stage we were beginning to feel that there was a possibility there. Then, of course, when the Japanese start to flex their muscles before they actually bombed Pearl Harbor, but they were moving into Thailand. They were moving in by an agreement, but it was threats that they got in on, of course. So yes, we were beginning to talk that, gee, this might. And then, of course, when the war started with Germany, we were immediately sent into a month's camp straight away. We were sent to Raymond Terrace, by the way, in the park at Raymond Terrace, and then every 3 months, so we did 3 camps. We then were sent to Greta. Why we were sent to those areas was that there was an area allotted for all the Australian Army, Militia Army as it was then, and the 1st Division, which I was 1st Division signalled, and all its ancillaries of engineers and artillery. We had to defend Port Stephens. So that's why we were, and being divisional headquarters, we were back a bit from the water. So all our training then was up and down to Port Stephens and through there. And later on, it was thought that Port Stephens, but we were in the AIF by this stage, but it was thought that Port Stephens, if Japan invaded Australia, Port Stephens would be very definitely one, because you can bring a boat in there and you can land there and so on. So yes, we began really to realise that something could happen. And as I said earlier, it was the fall of Paris, the fall of France. Up to that stage, Australia only had one division, and that was the 6th Division when the first people went over. Well, then very quickly, of course, 7th, 8th. The 9th Division was formed before the 7th and 8th, strangely enough, because it was formed when they needed more people in the Middle East. So that was formed by sending some people over from here and some of the others over there. So it was a bit of a mishmash. So the 9th is very much a bit earlier division than either the 7th or the 8th.
Your friends in the militia, were they worried about were they frightened by the prospect of going into
No, I think
service?
we were all young enough to be adventurous, and I think our attitude was, well, of course, again, at that age, you never think anything's going to happen to you. That's part of that age, and that's part of young people growing up too. You've got to take risks and so on, and you do take some chances. And that's absolutely right. Who wants a nation of tame cats? If you don't, a bit game and we're willing to take a risk when you're young, what are you going to do?
What kind of training did you do when you were in the AIF for dispatch riding?
Well, map reading, first of all, familiarisation of the motorbike, the maintenance of it. We trained in, though we did have a maintenance group attached to us, but day-to-day maintenance. Our kit of tools, we could have had a fairly good kit of tools, but old-time motorcyclists like me, we reckon you can get by beautifully on 2 tools. One's a screwdriver and the other is a multi-grip. You know, a pair of pliers, in other words, with the big ones. You could do most things with them. Map reading is most important, of course, because if you're in action, you're sent to completely naturally unfamiliar places. So you've got to plot it on a map first. Compass reading, we trained on. Arms training. Our arms training was revolvers, because you don't carry, as a dispatch rider, you don't carry a rifle, but you carried a revolver. What other training? We trained as infantry, because you've got to be prepared to do that. We did shooting tests every now and again. We were well trained right across the board, I would say. Mounting guard training, which we hated and got out of every time we could. And that's one thing you could really do as a motorcyclist, because if you were going to be on guard duty tonight and you didn't want to do it, and you were out on delivering something through the day, you'd very much have a engine failure or a tyre burst and you weren't able to get back. But no, general training right through. History of the war. We even did war history to a certain extent, get lectures of that type of thing. We got, and again, coming back to my early days, as I say, really militia days plus my other, we had about 4.5 years of good training. So we were highly trained, there was no doubt about it, and we knew our way around on training. As we start to deliver our messages to instructions in action, one of the first things that we became aware of was that as we were going through a village, we'd find either a wire or a rope across the road, which would pull you, come across you and throw you off your bike. And they were put up, we found very quickly, we told our intelligence people, a couple of fellas were quite nastily injured. And then, of course, the Chinese, the Malays, some of them, as the fellow was trying out, would come out of the bush with a parang, and there was an attempt to attack them. If you could get your revolver out quickly, they'd run for their lives. So we had a talk amongst ourselves, and we approached our CO, who approached Gordon Bennett, and we asked to be armed with Mills bombs, with grenades as well, because what we did, the moment we'd slow down as we came into a village, we'd get out and show it to the, and because they knew what a grenade was, and they got out of the road, and so we carried our arms were from then until the finish of the war were revolvers and grenades. And the grenades, I say, they put a stop to the other, because what we did, we threw a few of them, and the explosion and so on, they knew what would happen, and so that's what we were armed with.
So there were times when dispatch riders had to use their arms.
Throw them, very much so. If they were threatened, because there was a war on. But the grenades were very effective and very sensible for us to have. And I understand that was adopted also by the Australians here once we became POWs. You know, when they went to New Guinea and other places, what we'd found out. Some of them. Actually, Bennett wrote a very top-line assessment of what you, and that was used right through by the Australian Army on the experiences in Malaya, because we were the first people in action against the Japanese.
Was dispatch riding a lonely job? Was dispatch riding a lonely job at times?
Yes, at times it's lonely, yes. What we did once this trouble started, where we had enough personnel, unless everybody was, we rode in pairs. And what we used to do, we'd toss a penny between us, so who was the fellow going to ride in front first? Then you'd ride in front to one village and change over. But yes, it could be lonely, because that was one thing, that you were away on your own. And of course, at times you were in areas where the Japanese had come through, and they'd come through so swiftly, which they did down the peninsula, that we in some areas we were behind the lines. But the moment you woke up, because mainly the Japanese were working through the jungle, of course, and or of course they were working behind tanks. If they were coming down and the tanks were shielding them in the front, well, they came down the roads then.
Did you ever come across a time when you were attacked by the Japanese, when you were
shot at, yes. Particularly sniper fire. They used snipers a heck of a lot, and of course dispatch riders were a fair game for that. But of course you had a speedy little bike, and if you heard a crack, well, you'd weave, and you'd do anything to protect yourself, of course, and go as fast as you could to get out of it. Yeah.
Did you have trouble finding where you had to take messages to at times?
But many times, and the main reason was that they weren't at the spot that the commanders who'd sent us, or whoever had sent us, that was the last known spot. But the Japanese came down that peninsula so fast that quite often, and then to find them wasn't easy, of course. And sometimes you couldn't find them, of course. You had to get back to your depot and perhaps start again. Or perhaps they'd have a message back by then that had been transmitted that we've moved to so-and-so. The further we got down, the harder and harder it became. And on Singapore Island, it was extremely difficult there, because the movement, you see, it only took a fortnight for the Japs to capture Singapore from when they crossed the Straits, and within a week they were in all sorts of spots that were unknown. And the worst thing too, to try and find them, the Japanese, the loss of civilians from bombing, particularly, see what happened as we shrunk into the little area, so the civilians shrunk in with us, particularly the Chinese. It was estimated that there were well over 1 million Chinese in that last 3 or 4 square miles down, and trying to get to anywhere in that area. It's not a nice thing to talk about, but you're literally riding over bodies of people, and women, kids, the whole lot. It'll never be known how many died in it. But see, one of the reasons, the very definite reason there had to be the surrender, that was happening, and of course the Japanese captured the water supply and cut the water off. So actually, possibly it would have been better to do the surrender without trying to defend Singapore. Would have probably been better to do it at the Straits of Johor. See, we blew up the viaduct across the thing, and within 12 hours the Japs had sealed it again. And we're
Just talking about Malaya, but I might take you back to the day you disembarked Australia to head off.
Right. Well, of course, we were naturally wildly excited, but a little apprehensive, and that was very definite, because we didn't know how we were going to be greeted. Our first thoughts were we surrendered and nobody will want to talk to us. These other people have been in a war for 3.5 years, all the people that we knew, and we really were apprehensive. It wasn't talked about publicly, but we, amongst ourselves, and we all knew, we were all feeling much the same way, and we just wondered whether we would be welcomed back to the country that was our home. Anyhow, they want to make certain that we were deloused of anything, so we went through there. The funny thing that happened, however, some of our boys spotted that there was shirts and singlets and all sorts of things in a store at the end of this hut. We forgot that our loved ones were outside. We stole everything we could. We didn't even need it, but that's what we've been doing for 3.5. Funny. One of the things that I did bring home with me, and some of them did, was parachutes that were dropped with the Catalinas, I said, dropping food. They were pure silk, a lot of them, and we bought. Pat made a lot of undercoats out of poor silk. Where they deloused them, but they let us bring them in. But we were about 2 hours stealing stuff while our loved ones are waiting for us. Not that we could see them.
Did you know when you were leaving Australia that you were heading for Singapore?
No, we just were hoping that we would be joining all our friends in the Middle East. You see, that's where everybody was. But they had issued us with what we call Bombay bloomers, but they were long shorts. And strangely enough, the ones that they issued us with for mosquitoes, of course they'd got the idea got the instructions from the British Army, but they went over your knees, and we called them bombers, they were big, but then they had a button either side, and you could turn them up and button them or drop them down. I suppose they were quite wise in the Indian Army and whatnot, but we hated the darn things. And one of the first things most of us did when we got to Kuala Lumpur, in those days, of course, it was like Hong Kong. They had these tailors everywhere, and most of us got a decent pair of slacks and a couple of decent pair of shorts made. Quick, you could get them done for a couple of dollars, because they were terrible looking things. But you had to wear them while you were on duty because they were part of the rule.
Was there a fear at all that, because Japan hadn't entered the war, but was there a fear that Australia...
Our worry was that we'd be left there as... See, we were left there in the first instance as garrison troops, to garrison the thing. But then we start to think, and these older boys said to you, look, what they normally do with garrison troops is do a tour of duty, and then you go on, and they'd send someone back from say from the Middle East there, or new ones coming in from, but it all moved too quickly. And see, but the intelligence people were certain, probably about halfway through the year before the Japs come, that they would come in, and of course they did come in. See, they linked up with the Nazis. If they could have kept going, they got held in Burma. That General Slim held them in Burma, and otherwise, part of what they were doing was to go through India and link up with the Italians, so they had the world then once they went through there, and they certainly would have taken over Australia. So we still hope and feel that. See, the Japs had planned, and all their correspondence stuff that we got and the plans after the war, they planned to take New Guinea in, or take Malaya in 5 to 6 weeks. Well, our battalions and ourselves, we held them for 13 weeks, and that slowed them down in New Guinea and possibly allowed the Java Sea, the Coral Sea battle to take, which was the turning point for stopping the Japs. But if they'd got through India and the Axis had won the war, well, that was it. So, and of course the other thing that I said to you, that uncomfortable part about Singapore Island, about the Japanese general that it was not going to surrender. The other thing we knew very much, and of course it was confirmed afterwards, they had intended, there were no prisoners of war going to be allowed alive. The Teno Hiker had agreed to that, and they were going to, as Japan was invaded, or Singapore, or we were all for the jump. We knew that. In Singapore, the Chinese at the finish, that 500 rat, they were smuggling a bit of arms into us because they had 4 machine gun posts from just round us, and they smuggled a bit of stuff, or were smuggling stuff into us, and they were also going to rise and try and help too, but I don't think many would have got out of it. But the definite arrangement, and strangely enough, the day of the surrender, that was to be the signing off of quite a bit of where they were going to execute all the prisoners. So we had to be a bit of luck looking around somewhere. I always get rather amused when I hear people saying what a shocking thing it was for the Japs to drop the atom bomb. If the war hadn't finished then, America would have, or we would have, with America and others, we would have invaded Japan. There would have been millions lost on both sides. So I don't go along with saying that we did the wrong thing. Probably it was a pity that in some ways an atom bomb was ever invented, but you can't stop it.
I guess what Singapore, the garrison at Singapore and the naval base meant at the time to Australia in general, if that's not an odd question.
I don't know about Australians in general at that stage, because we were broken up into various parties. I can only perhaps answer that question by saying that in my instance, as a dispatch rider, we got onto all parts of the island and had a pretty good idea within a day or two of what was going on. This was after the Japanese landed on Singapore Island, and as you know, the battle for Singapore Island lasted 14 days. As far as I'm concerned, and my fellow dispatch riders and others in signals, we were aware almost immediately that there was no real defence on Singapore at all. There's the story of the guns being pointed the wrong way. Well, that's not true. They could have swiveled them round. One of the early things, we wondered why it was apparent that the Japanese headquarters for the attack on Singapore was in Johor Bahru, the town, and our own intelligence showed that the main commanders were in the palace there, and for some reason or other, the order was given that they weren't to, we weren't to fire cannons and so on at the palace because of its sensitive nature. But it was known that the Japanese headquarters were there, and why that was done, I'm not sure. But that came obviously from right at the top, from the British general, who was the commanding officer of the whole of the island. Then on Singapore, after the landing, my signals unit, part of us were down fairly close to where the landing took place. It was again apparent fairly quickly that our defence there was spread out right along the island front, and in no way was it concentrated or could be concentrated enough to defend the whole lot. We were out along Bukit-Timah Road, which was the main road coming in from the coast right through, and we were out in that area, and again we were starting after 2 or 3 days of pulling back, much the same pattern as followed Malaya, where again the forces had to pull back all the way down. So my thoughts, and many others, are that everything that could be done as far as the troops were concerned, the battalions of Australian infantry, the British battalions, they fought, and they fought the Japanese, but again, it was overwhelming. The main trouble, of course, was that we had no air cover. I think I mentioned this before. We had no tanks, and the Japanese were able to get all this stuff over, and it was quite apparent that there would be only one ending to this, and the ending would be that the Japanese would capture Singapore Island. As far as what happened to me and to others of my group, we pulled back to about 3 different spots, as we said, running out of land all the time, and we came back down Bukit-Timah Road to Bukit-Timah Village, then down to one or two of the other areas, and finally, of course, right back into the city. And the roads were absolutely packed with refugees coming down from the mainland, mainly Chinese, and again the Chinese had no thought that they wouldn't be in trouble, because the Japanese had said from the beginning that anything that the Chinese did to help us would be severely punished. I think I mentioned 30,000 of them were executed in the first few weeks of the occupation. However, they still tried to help us, and we've never forgotten it. Finally, when we pulled back into the city area, the water was cut off. The Japanese had captured the water supply area, and they cut the water off, and which is what we would probably have done. Well, we would have done the same thing if the boot had been on the other foot. The streets were absolutely jammed with refugees. There were various estimates, even up to 1 million refugees in a city that didn't have 1 million people ordinarily in it. The streets were a carnage. There were dead bodies everywhere, and services were breaking down. As far as my 8th Division Signals Unit and the Australians under General Gordon Bennett, General Bennett made it clear that he wanted the Australians kept together. He still wanted command over and knowing exactly what the Australians are doing. And that actually happened. And right up till the actual surrender, General Gordon Bennett through our signals unit, had contact with all of the main Australian, or the remnants of the units that were left. So he had his contact there, and we dispatch riders in that last area were probably the main source of communication, because the lines were out, the wirelesses weren't operating under the circumstances there as well as they could. So we saw a fair bit, well, we saw everything that was going on, even up to 2 or 3 days, or 2 days before the surrender. Gordon Bennett nominated about 500 Australians, or from various units, the most experienced, to be evacuated a couple of days before the surrender, with the thought that they were the first troops that had contact with the Japanese and could hopefully get back to Australia and take their experience back of jungle warfare and all the other different things that had happened. One of the things that was noticeable was that a lot of civilians, particularly wives and the children, wouldn't leave the island up till the last moment because they wanted to stop with their husband or the family, and it wasn't a sensible thing to do, but you could understand it. They kept hoping that things would change around, which they didn't, and so it wasn't very nice to see women and children trying to get on boats that they couldn't get onto, but finally most of them did. Unfortunately, some of them were on the Vina Brook, which had our nurses on it, and that was bombed and sunk. Some got out of it, some didn't. And as you know, 22 of our nurses who managed to get ashore were executed on Banker Island by the Japanese, just pushed into the sea. So the last 2 weeks, the Australians, I saw nothing of the Australian defence breaking down in such a way that they weren't under command. So they were still a group of men trying to do the best they could and doing the best they could. And casualties among the Japanese were high, as they were with us. But that last fortnight, as far as I was concerned, it was quite apparent that there'd be no evacuation. There was no way, because, again, the complete command of the air by the Japanese. Secondly, the complete command of the sea, because the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, those mighty warships, were sunk early, and so a sad story, Singapore, but I've always felt, and I still do, that our Australian, our AIF group, did all that could be done under the circumstances, and a lot more than could be done in many cases. If this hadn't finished up the way it did, there would have been a lot of well-earned decorations for Australians.
At what point, Jim, I guess, did you realise that there wasn't going to be an evacuation and that it was going to be surrender or...?
Well, I felt it came to me when, and to probably the signals group that I was with, who were in touch with everything, when the 500 were pulled out. It wasn't said, of course, that they were going to be pulled out to go back. That's what they were. What they were told, and we were told, that they were going to go up and try and land up on the mainland behind the Japanese. But that was just to make certain that this group went, because a lot of them would have dug their heels in and said, we'll stop with our mates, we're not going. But they thought, my signals group, there was a small group of ours, the best of our unit, and they thought, and we thought, that they were just going up to do a landing, and that was it. So it's hard to say. I think the majority of us wouldn't accept that there was going to be a surrender. And we were in shock when the surrender took place, when the order came from the top that lay down your arms, and so you don't refuse that, of course, because you're under command, and that's it. So I would say that by far most of us, except perhaps some of the senior officers who would have a better idea of what was going on, and conferences with Gordon Bennett, I don't think that most of us, and I certainly didn't realise there would be a surrender if they told us. That was it. And the whole thought in our minds was that, well, we'll have another crack and see what we can do. But we wouldn't accept it, of course, that we wouldn't even think about surrender. So, and of course, Gordon Bennett and his senior officers were still there at the surrender, and for an hour or so afterwards, before they told us, I was at divisional headquarters where he was with other signals, and he thanked us for what we'd done, and then told us that he was, my memory is that was about 8 o'clock at night, about an hour and a half after the surrender, and he pointed out that it was the duty of every soldier to try and escape, and told us that he was going, so there was no pretense about what happened there. And again, I'd say almost without exception, we all felt he was doing the right thing. Get out if you can and take your knowledge back, which he did, by the way. He did take his knowledge back, and after we came home many years afterwards, it came out that a thesis that he did on fighting the Japanese was used in New Guinea. So these things, as far as we know, were done. So, in answer to your question, I don't think any of us, the majority, far but biggest majority, would have even thought there was going to be a surrender. But we didn't go beyond that, thinking what might happen to us if it didn't happen.
Jim, can you just describe, I guess, you've mentioned that the Japanese had control of the sea and air, and
Yep.
I've read that there was quite heavy bombardment, bombing of Singapore just before the surrender.
Well, there was bombing of Singapore from the day they landed up in the north of Malaya. They kept coming over in flights of 27 planes. It was quite a complete pattern. But of course, before they landed on Singapore Island, there was very heavy bombardment from their guns on their side of the Straits of Johor, and they were softening up, of course, the city and everywhere else. So the bombing just increased and increased and increased. And the sad part about it, with the just few planes that hadn't been shot out of the sky, really after they landed on the island, there was no planes of ours. They'd all been shot out of the sky. One of the pilots, of course, was our Prime Minister of a later day, John Gorton, and you only got to see the scar on his face if you look at the photos to see what happened to him. But he was lucky. He crash landed on an island off Singapore and was picked up by the Navy, the small boats of the Navy. So the bombing was quite horrendous. I'd say as heavy a bombing as you would have seen done on any city at any time. And again, getting back to the pathetic civilians who were there, no way of dodging the bombing, and I'm sure that apart from the water being cut off, all the other things cut off, probably the main reason for the order to surrender was to stop the killing which would have gone on of thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians.
Can you describe for me, Jim, you've mentioned that you were told about the surrender and then you did try and make an escape.
Yeah.
I just wonder if you could describe when you heard about the surrender.
Well,
your reaction?
When we heard about it, and General Gordon Bennett spoke to our small group, just because our job was communication there, and he reminded us, if my memory serves me correctly, but I think it does, that it was a duty. He probably reminded us because he was telling us that he, and assisted by Major Moses, who used to be the chief of your ABC, had planned to give it a go to get out, and Moses had got hold of a small boat. It was only like our Halverson cruisers, that type of thing, and so three of my friends and myself, because we were where a division or where the headquarters were in that small 3 square mile area of the city, was right on the water's edge. And Tangland Barracks, where I was only a short distance down to the water, and we went down to have a look around to see. We thought there might have been boats pulling out there, that a little bit like a miniature thing that happened in France when the Germans came through. And but what we realised when we got down there, that the boats that were still around, and they were only rowboats and that type of thing, the thought was that you'd get into one of those and get out and perhaps be picked up, but they'd all been sabotaged. The bottoms knocked out of them, and so we realised fairly quickly that unless something organised happened, that there was no way that we could get away. There was the odd exception. There was one man from my own unit who'd always been a bushman all his life, and he got a little boat, and he was attacked by some Malays. Off Singapore Island, there are villages built in the water where they catch fish from, so on, and they tried to get him, and I'm afraid he attacked them and got rid of them, and he got in a small boat somewhere where he was picked up first, dropped over in Java or Sumatra, and he got home. I mean, but that was almost a miracle odd one. There certainly was never any large organised then, as far as the group of people I was with.
Were there any cases that you saw, I guess, of anybody doing anything quite drastic, whether maybe trying to swim off the island or even taking their own life in?
No, not. I saw nothing of it, and I don't think that happened because it hasn't come out since. And there might have been some odd incident. Certainly, I don't think anyone would have tried to swim it. The Japanese were at that stage in charge of all that area. They'd come through, and so it was only 2 days, as you've probably been told, after the surrender when they had us on the march to Changi. So there wasn't a great deal of time, but there were odd incidents where people tried to got into the little jungle that there is around on the island, but the few who did, I don't know of any exception, but the few who did finally realised that their best chance of anything was to stick with the crowd, and people joined us in Changi for some weeks after the surrender, who had decided to try and give it a go, but reached a stage where they realised that there was practically no way to get off.
What did you know, I guess once you'd heard about the surrender, of what to expect as a POW?
What we expected?
Well, what did you know about, I guess, prisoners of war and how you would be treated, or?
Well, we all knew, of course, that if we were questioned, we were only allowed set answers and so on. We had some of us, particularly people who'd followed things that the Japanese had been involved in, and particularly involved for years in China, as you know. we wondered what the treatment would be. We were, in the first instance, we wondered whether there would be, after the surrender, whether there could be a massacre on the island. It'd be silly if you didn't have it in your mind, because the Japanese, places like Nanking and many other places, had behaved in a certain way. The Japanese also believed and practiced that surrender was out of the question for them, and they were good soldiers in that direction. No, I think the average soldier wondered what it would be like. You start to think about it. On the march out to Changi, which took all night, as no doubt you've read, and I was a little surprised that there were Japanese guards, of course, on both sides of the road. I didn't see any ill treatment of a soldier on that. I think you know, and we all thought afterwards that the attitude, the original attitude on the island, was the attitude of fighting soldiers, just as our crowd were. And I think they respected that. The ill treatments that start to come at later dates were generally of garrison-type troops and so on. But I think the soldier who'd been fighting our fellows, with some exceptions, such as Muir, that you've been told about, I'm sure, with odd exceptions, I think they respected, to their way of thinking, respected that they were fighting other people who were soldiers too. The only ill treatment that any of us saw on that march was generally ill treatment of Chinese who were showing sympathy to us and trying to hand us water and bits of food and so on, which they did. And now and again we'd see them get their face slapped or pushed with the butt of a rifle, and so it went on. But there wasn't a great deal of it. I've got to be straight about that. And once we arrived in Changi, again we wondered, you know, about guards and so on. But all that the Japanese did was tell us to get to work and make ourselves, pick out where we want to stop ourselves in the Changi barracks, not the jail, as you know, it was the barracks for 2 years. And so I think what we learnt of what the treatment would be like by experiencing it, because it had never happened before to our types of troops anywhere, and certainly not with the Japanese, because, as you know, in the First World War they were allies. So there was no. We were in the learning section of what happened, and what happened to us was then experienced by at Corregidor by the Americans, and so it went on. But we were all in a learning curve, because there was no sort of, the only history was the history of what happened in China. And there, they apparently, from all my readings and what we know, their ill treatment was because you were a Chinese, not a soldier, not anything else. And it went on. But I feel that we were the first to experience what then became a pattern.
Can you describe for me, Jim, I guess, what Changi looked like on that first, your first impressions of it?
Yeah, right. Again, being a dispatch writer, I had seen the Changi barracks before the Japanese, and it was a very, you've seen photos, I'm sure, but it was a typical British barracks, a big square in the centre, buildings right round it, nice homes for the officers, because they were garrison troops in those days. It's the same as we treat ours now. And when we, well, first of all, of course, some of us had seen the start of the wrecking of a lot of buildings by bombing, and we'd seen it. So it wasn't quite a complete shock. But when we marched into the area in the early hours of the morning, it was a slight shock because the buildings were wrecked completely. And the first thing that, again, the headquarters group who'd come in first had done the allotment of where you'd go to, and my own group of signals, we were allotted a two-storey, really semi-detached building on one side, a building on the other, not up in the big barracks. The battalions went up into theirs, and it had no roof on it, and the sides had been bombed and gone in. So there was nothing much there except a wrecked building. So the first job was to make it as habitable as possible, to keep out the rain if we could. But the whole of that area had been heavily bombed, and British troops were using the area. Yes, the whole, it was only part of Singapore Island, all of which, practically all of the main areas had been wrecked, and these barracks had been wrecked because the Japanese knew that they were occupied by British troops. So the whole of the early months there was those people who were left there in those early months was to bit by bit get the buildings going. There was no sewage. The sewage was wrecked. There was no electricity. But our units who had experience in this sort of thing, the engineers who had electrical people, as far as the sewage was concerned, we put in boreholes straight away, but eventually they got the sewage going. I don't know how long it took. It was after I'd left to go to Thailand, but when we came back from Thailand, the place was pretty orderly. You know, they had over the years got the water going again. No doubt the Japanese got it going too in other areas. When we came back, it was in pretty reasonable condition.
How overcrowded was Changi?
Oh, well, extremely. For instance, the whole of those barracks had always been built to house a battalion and the extra troops. I'd say no more than 1,000. And I understand that in the early days in Changi there was about 25,000. Exact numbers would have been hard to ascertain in there, but bit by bit they would ascertain them. So, you know, they were absolutely crowded, as we were in prison camps wherever we went. The ones that we were really unlucky is where there was nowhere to house, and you spent your time under a bush on the Thai Railway without it. But it was very, very crowded. But once again, organisation, orderlists came in with good organisation. We did the 8th Division. We had good men at the top, men of experience in all sorts of trades and businesses. We had amongst the troops tons of bricklayers and builders and so on. So the first thing was to get into it, and we got into it. I didn't see a lot of it, as I mentioned to you before, because I kept going with a lot of others out of the working party, which the Japs had us doing right from the beginning, because the first job was to clean up the city, or to make it just clean up. So they had us working on that constantly. And so I think I mentioned to you before, I like any of the so-called fit, were out working for the Japanese.
What were the jobs you were doing to clean up the city?
Well, no, just cleaning up, first of all, the rubbish in the streets, and just getting things at least cleaned up so people could move around. What the Japs had us doing too, or had groups doing, was unloading ships, of course, because their boats now had all the anchorage and they were bringing in arms and everything else to continue on the war. So a big group of that. Ironically enough, a small group that I was with, we were put in a bombed-out home at a place called Lorney Road, Singapore, which was a very high-class residential area, but it had no roof on it, and it was for just a normal, fairly well-off family. And there would have been probably about 150 of us in that, and those well-off homes, they all had servants' quarters at the back of them, and I was one of 10 in two little areas there that the cook used to live in one and the cleaner used to live in the other. So you're packed in those, just the same as the Japanese packed us into a Changi jail in the latter part of the war. So I'm afraid you become accustomed very, very quickly to being packed in. Generally, whatever they allotted only allowed you to lie down shoulder to shoulder. But then again, with Singapore climate, I think half of my time, if I was in a place like that, you'd sleep out in the open if it wasn't a monsoon season, just on the path or something. You're far better off there. But as you say, what were we doing? This home was right opposite the Royal Singapore Golf Club, beautiful golf course, and there was a little dam in the middle of it, water hazard we have for golf and for them. And our job there, and I was working there, I think, for about 4 months, was to erect a monument to the glorious Japanese dead. And they put one of these poles that they put up with markings on it as a monument. And they had a group building a little mound out in the lake, and the grass, to make it beautiful, came from the greens on the golf course. So we had that area. One interesting thing that happened there, the Japanese spoke to people and would know what tools and so on we wanted, and we had to put a road in, and a road through the lake out to the mound. And one of the things they said, we would want a roller, and they gave us a steam roller. So it's typical of the old steam rollers in country towns, or like the diesel ones that they use now, but with steam. And they found a fellow who'd worked for a council on these, and he used to go down in the steamroller to the Japanese headquarters each day to get fuel for it. But what he got was petrol, which he immediately found a way of selling to the Chinese. And the Japanese issued petrol for a steamroller. Anyhow, they eventually found out and did this fellow over and knocked him about. And some Japanese fellow said, I'll get on this. And he lit the petrol and blew the roller up at the same time, and himself. But they were peculiar things. The Japanese were so clever in many ways, but also so innocent. And they issued him with petrol for weeks, just to run his steamroller. Anyway, so that was our job there, to erect this monument to the Japanese. There were all sorts of odd jobs, but certainly the majority of those in Singapore, bit by bit, or those who were in Changi, bit by bit, were on working parties, with the exception, of course, of all the wounded, and there were several thousand wounded because they were British troops, Indian troops, Australian troops, and So bit by bit they got us working, ultimately the Burma Thai Railways, where they took thousands. And so that's the way it went.
When did you get the news that you were heading out of Changi? And
We lived on rumours, furfies we used to call them, of course, and the best place to get the rumours was down at the latrines and so on. But what happened, of course, the first group went away quite early. A-Force, as it was known, put on a boat and taken. They didn't know where they were going, but they were taken up to work. And again, they were told, as we were told later on, when we were being sent by the Japanese, that there'd be no food worries. There was tons of food up there and a nice climate, and everything was going to be great. Well, so they went, and that was several thousand, and we saw them go, and then we saw what we call B and E group, which went to Borneo. So with rumour and actual facts that were we realised the Japanese were gradually getting parties away to go to various spots. I think part of their strategy too would be to break up these thousands of men, because if they'd been left in one spot and things start to get sticky on the island, these thousands could be a threat to the Japanese. But also they saw where they had absolutely free working parties. So up till your name came up, what the Japanese did, they let our headquarters, the Japanese were very, very shrewd in that they didn't do these things themselves. They ordered the Japanese were the first people that we were ever in conflict with that didn't take officers straight away from the men the day after they became, put them in officers' camps. But the Japanese did entirely the opposite. They took a few of the absolute top men. They would have taken Gordon Bennett. We would never have seen him again. They took the British commander, the Dutch commander, sent them to Mature. Some of them went up to Korea, various places. So they took the real, just a handful, when I say a handful, relatives to the balance, and took them far away. But they left everyone from Colonel down. That's where we got Blackjack Gallagher and good men like him. And they told them what they wanted and then said, you get them. And the group that I went with, we knew about a week before that they'd ordered for a certain date, or about a week or so afterwards, 7,000 men. Again, being told that, and there was some competition to get on it. I think the average Australian did what I did. You never volunteered for anything, but you took it when it came. But we would have, in that week before, 10 days before, I happened to be on the first train. A train took up to 700 men, as you know, and I happened to be on that. But we knew, and we started to talk about, and they never mentioned Thailand. They mentioned North that we were going, but so we were, because of what we'd seen happen to the people who went to Burma. Not that we knew they were going, but going away. Then the other lots, and we knew the trucks that took them in. Some of the trucks were manned by our own people, and we knew that they were going on train or boats to Borneo, boats to Burma, train to north. So we knew, and as I say, you didn't battle it because you well, the old story, you didn't try to get out or get in. You just went with the tide.
Cool. Jim, you just mentioned about the how in the march to Changi it was quite orderly,
Yeah.
and that I guess Japanese ill treatment didn't start till later. Just wondering if you can talk us a little bit about how it began or what you saw of it starting to take place in Changi?
No, I don't think really ill treatment in Changi registered on us much, because we were left to ourselves. We had to put, as no doubt you know, some barbed wire up, but it was just a sort of a token, because you could get in or out of it, but of course what was on the other side is a different matter, and they did patrol it. But actual ill treatment in Changi, I've got to be honest, I didn't see any really sign of day-to-day ill treatment of them. There was things occurred. You've heard about the square incident, I know that, or you have, haven't you?
Not me personally. I
Right.
don't believe you.
Well, let me tell you about the square incident. The Japanese produced a document for everybody to sign, which was a promise that you would not try to escape.
Yes.
We were scattered around in Changi at that stage, thousands, but in various areas, and we refused under orders from our own people, and in any case we would have refused, because that's part of your duty, that you don't sign a promise to non-escape. The Japanese threatened all sorts of dire consequences if we didn't, and took 2 men down to Changi Beach, took Blackjack and the British general down there, and they took a squad of Indian soldiers and executed them in front of our people on the beach, saying that they were trying to escape. Well, they apparently had got under the wire looking for food and so on, which was done constantly, but that was the warning, and they shot them on the beach. Well, now we knew that of ill treatment straight away. As far as the document for us to sign, they herded the whole lot into what was a square that a battalion used to demonstrate work on and train on, and they cut the wood. Well, there was no toilet facilities, nothing. We had to try and make do, and we were there a few days, and disease started to break out, and finally we were instructed by a commanding officer, was Blackjack Gallagher, to sign the document, pointing out that it was signed under duress and therefore didn't have any legal consequences. But that was quite orderly, as you said. We were there. We had a fair bit of experience at that stage of making do with anything, and I felt the behaviour there in those few days was excellent. Every order was carried out. Everything was done to try and keep things as orderly as possible, disease down, and but it started to really come up. Our doctors now talk to the superior officers, and that's where we signed under duress. But again, getting back to ill treatment, physical ill treatment, not a lot of that would have been seen in day-to-day. This was probably, and again, as I put out to you, I was only in and out of Changi, and no doubt there would be, from time to time, a Japanese who was in the camp for some reason, or coming through down near the wire, got cranky, or that was it. But the ill treatment that I became accustomed to, of course, was the Burma Thai Railway.
Mm-hmm. We'll move on to that now, Jim, if we could. I guess you, just wonder if you could, talk to us about the march, and I think you mentioned in the last time we spoke about banding together in groups of 6 or 7.
That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit about, when that started to happen?
Yes, I can. I was with the first group put on trains, and they sent 7,000 up, so that took 2 or 3 weeks. And I arrived in that first group on Anzac Day 1943, April the 25th, strangely enough, Anzac Day.
Banded together.
Well, when we arrived, we were housed in a at-up hut, which was absolutely foul by the, obviously there'd been Malayans and people from Indonesia. They had thousands of them, of course, as I told you before, and they didn't have any real organisation, and the place was fouled. We went in there and we worked nearly all night and cleaned the place up, because we knew another group of ours were arriving in a day or two. We were lined up then the following morning outside that hut, and the Japanese officer who spoke English told our people what was happening, and we were informed that we were to march, not how far, but would march for some days into what would turn out to be the jungle, and going up the river, up the period. As far as I can remember, and also, as you say, books have been written about this, I think we marched for about 12 nights, and we did march for about 180 miles. Thinking as we did then in miles, and I still do. We marched for about 12 nights. It was a really trying thing, because we weren't in that good a condition, and of course quite a lot of the people who'd been selected to go weren't really fit to go, because it had been hoped that they would be going to a place where food was better and so on. We set out, we found fairly quickly that the Japanese would not march a day because of the heat in the jungle, and so we marched of a night, and the theory was that we went from one day or one night, arrived early morning and had a rest. Well, those rests were a bit pretense, because the Japanese immediately had us working to make them comfortable, and where some places needed cleaning up straight away, or there mightn't have been much shelter. So it got more and more trying. I think to complete the approximate 12 days and 180 miles was quite remarkable, in that I don't remember in our first group anyone dying on that march, but people fairly quickly started to need help. So not only were you trying to get there yourself, carrying supplies that the Japanese, whatever, and trying to help your mates who couldn't make it. So I'm afraid that went on for the 12 days and nights. Getting back to what you asked me to, as I said, matesmanship really started to show then, and fuelled, of course, by the need to help each other. As far as the 6 or 7 are concerned, I would say that started to happen about 6 or 7. It might have been 5, might have been 8. In my group it was 6, 7. And that started to operate really from the first night of the march. One of my closest friends, who's still alive, John Parks, he was a very young soldier. I mean, he was 19 and I was 23, and I was an old man. And I was with a corporal of ours, Les Lowe, who was a wonderful soldier, and he'd grouped a few of us. We, almost unconsciously, you became together, your mates. And I saw this rather very young-looking fellow milling around, and I realised straight away I hadn't seen him before. He'd come over with some reinforcements only a couple of months before the surrender. So, and he was in a different section of signals to me, and I'm sure what I did, he tells me that this is what I did, I'd walked over to him and said, how are you going? You got anyone here with you? And he said, no. He said, my group aren't on this. Yes, I said to him, well, come over and be with us. Turned out he was good value too. He was younger than some of us, and that friendship, by the way, I was best man, well, not best man. I was one of his helper at his wedding a couple of years after, and he came to my wedding my wedding took place with it just a few months of coming home, and so our friendship. He was here for lunch 2 days ago, and I watched his kids grow up, and he watched my son grow up to the age he did, and so that's the sort of thing that happened. And I'd say that unconscious matesmanship happened quite quickly, because we realised straight away that we'd better to have a bit of a group and be able to help. In our little group, a chap called Ken Davidson, it was one of the early ones when we started work on the railway, who got a tropical ulcer on his leg and was unable to walk, and it looked as though they might have to amputate his leg, but we said no, and our little group of seven, we carried that fellow wherever we went, always. He was just part of the luggage, and we got him out, and he didn't lose his leg, and he came home. But that's the type of thing that happened. To put it just as it was, if one of us went down, the other 6 looked after, obviously. So I think I've said this many times, Mark, anybody who knocks matesmanship doesn't really know what it's all about. But what we found in 3 years and 8 months of it is it's very real, and thank goodness it is.
How would you physically march through a jungle at night time up to the railway?
Well, the Japs had their map, of course, and the Japs were very well organised and that sort of thing, as was found out by books that we've all read. They were mapping those areas several years before the war started. They were planning all the things that could happen. I only recently read an article where it was shown that they were mapping the railway several years before the war came, because they thought that, they wanted to invade India, and that was the only way of getting to it, and link up with the Nazis in Europe. This was the whole plan. But they were mapping it, so we naturally had to depend. We didn't know where we were going. As you rightly say, we were in the jungle in the middle of the night, and thick jungle in a lot of cases. So we just followed the Japs, that was it. But they obviously knew what they were doing. One of the things that started to happen fairly quickly, we all had to carry what we could carry of our own things, and one of the things, a lot of us at that stage probably had a spare pair of shorts or a shirt, that type of thing. We weren't carrying food because we couldn't, and the Japs had some rice for us when we got to eat, not a lot, but they had some rice. But this clothing, and some of the boys were carrying an extra pair, perhaps a pair of sand shoes that they'd pinched somewhere. We started, after several nights, being really attacked. And you'd lie down for what? So we used to march, we were supposed to march for 50 minutes and 10 minutes off, 50 minutes, and for the Japs as well as ourselves, and you'd flop over in the jungle wherever you were and just have a rest. And we found that some of the Thais who were a bandit type ties, they were after these extra bit of clothing and so on, and they started to attack some of the fellows, and there were some nasty incidents of them, and in some cases they got away with things like shirts and shorts, so that had to be watched very closely too. Wild animals, I don't know whether we'd hear all sorts of things, was monkeys and all that type of thing through, but it was wild animal country, it was tiger country and so on, so, but it was a matter of sticking together. As each night went by, the line got longer and longer in that fellows were dropping back, and this was where our doctor, Roy Mills, was so wonderful. I did say to you, I'm sure, previously, that when Roy Mills was allotted to us before we started the march as a young doctor, almost just out of uni, and I think I told you that the word went round, we're getting a boy for a doctor. Well, by the end of the march, he was the greatest man I'd ever met. But he used to, if we walked 180 miles, we always reckoned that he would have done at least 100 miles more himself, because he went up and down the line, and you'd see him coming in later and later in the day, carrying a couple of fellas what they had to carry. He was a great big man, and carrying and arming these fellas in. So that was mateship.
Absolutely. You mentioned the Thai bandits. Just
well, we call them bandits.
Yeah. Oh well,
yeah,
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
they were stealing.
Well, they were stealing our clothes, yeah, and they'd sell that straight away. You see, clothes were apparently short. That's what they were after. We found.
I mean, you mentioned that they were quite nasty incidents.
Well, somebody, them having a go at the fellow, he'd be 3/4 asleep, and well, they used to carry what we call parings, which is a blade, a heavy blade, and there were cases where they attempted to use them, but it was contained all right, but they were nasty incidents. I think that's the only way of describing it.
You mentioned before, I guess, a certain, cultural innocence of the Japanese. Were there times during the march and perhaps the work you were doing on the railway where you found that you could kind of take advantage of them in any way that would help you?
It's hard for me to answer that. No, I don't think really I could think of where we took advantage of that.
Or things that you would do just to make your life
a little easier.
A little easier.
A little easier. No, there were two things to make your life, I think, where I was involved, was keeping as far away from the Japs as you could, and not to provoke them, because we learned very early that if you provoke them, you've got a face slap first of all, which no Australian likes to have his face slapped, and there were incidents where fellows couldn't take that and retaliated by putting a fist in the Japanese face. Well, we very early found there was no future in that, because you'd get knocked about, which would aggravate anything else, dysentery, all the other things you had. So one of the early things you learned, if you could learn it, and some people can't and quite understand that, and just retaliate no matter what happens. But I think if you had common sense, you learn to take it as quietly as you can without provoking. Do as little work as you can, and that was the main thing, that you were not so much perhaps to slow the Japanese along, it was to keep your own health or keep your own strength going. No, I can't really answer that one because in my 12 months with the Japanese, it was on the railway, my 12 months on the railway, it was a matter, I feel, of using every effort for survival that you could.
What were some of the things that you, I guess, could do or would do to, I guess, work as little as you could or slow the Japanese down on the railway?
Well, again, your own strength came into it a lot. If you weren't physically a really strong person, you weren't doing, you're only doing what you could do, and that wasn't a lot. We had other men who had been in civilian life, road workers and that type of thing, were expert, and the Japanese too played on that, or perhaps not played on that, but what they did, they set us, when we first started on the railway, if you were doing a cutting, for instance, they said that you had to do a metre a day. It was a metre of work. If it needed depth, well, it had to be a metre each way. Some of the very good workers, if you got the metre done, they let you go back to camp. That was the reward for getting it done. What the innocent workers didn't realise, but they came to realise fairly quickly, as soon as you found you can do that and you got off early, well, it was a metre and a quarter the next day. And a week after it was a metre and a half, and then it was 2 metres. So the Japanese really were shrewd in that direction. But of course, they were the losers too, because as soon as this was really realised, everybody slowed down and cut down. The other thing with the Japanese too, their attitude is so hard to explain. Now, they were absolutely fanatical to get this railway finished. The Emperor had ordered it. It had to be finished by about the date it was too, or about the time. It would have been finished certainly and quicker if they'd fed us properly. But people were, as you know, dying all over the place, and so they were cutting off their nose to spite their face by not. And when I say feeding us properly, just a little more than we were getting would have made each bit more that you could get. There would be less people going down, not being able to go out, or as start to happen where we had to carry sick men out because they wanted their numbers, and sick men, and that's where some men did become complete and utterly impossible to work and very hard to understand. One of the things, but on the other side, they got that railway finished in October, and October, early November, it was finished. And as I think I mentioned in the earlier interview, I had been only from Anzac Day up to then about 6 months, and the thing was finished. And so they were starting to get trains through. Certainly they were getting bombed by our Allied planes from India, but they got quite a bit of stuff through. So
I've heard that some of the some fellas would the work that they would actually commit to the railway itself, like the sleepers and spikes, etc.
Yeah.
They were perhaps a little shoddy intentionally.
Well, anything that any of us saw that was poor quality, certainly you wouldn't bring it to the notice of the Japanese. You'd use it, of course you would. The stories go right through of even putting ants' nests in timber for it to eat away and so on. And But certainly, I think probably what I say is the main correct. It was very hard with the Japanese. For the working parties on the road, they stood over you all the time, so very hard to openly sabotage it. But anything that you were using that was poor, you'd leave it there, wouldn't you? Of course you would. Mind you, when we started to be brought down from well up the railway after it had been closed up, I know I looked over the side a couple of times at one bridge that we were crossing. Hope we'd get across that one. So it went on.
When you were working on the railway, what sort of things could you do, or would you perhaps do to console yourself in any way as to what you were doing on a day-to-day basis?
I think again, I know I'm belabouring it, but I think having your mates around you, we carried that on the railway as we started on the march, because again things were happening to some of your mates all the time. So being able, or hopefully able to help on that was. I felt the group was carrying our friend who got the ulcer, and that continued for the whole 6 months. I felt that was good, because we did it, and we wanted to do it, and we were quite determined that we were not going to let them start, because it would have meant an amputation. Dr. Roy Mills, by the way, had the proud record of never doing an amputation of our 7, and yet Weary Dunlop, all of them were naturally Dunlop, Coates, Dr. Coates, all the famous doctors, and they saved some lives. But if my memory is correct, 80 to 90% of the amputations ended in death. And but a lot of those amputations were done because of the pain and so on involved. But I think helping each other was the main thing, and that continued on the railway too.
Do you think, like as a mate, that it was actually the being a mate to somebody else, having responsibility to other people, that actually helped get you through?
I probably unconsciously it did. I must admit I can't remember thinking that, but thinking in retrospect it probably did. Well, I think the whole thing of looking after each other was really a consoling thing in anything that happened at all.
I'm just wondering, Jim, I mean, for everything that I've heard, mateship seems to be a tantamount thing. Are there particular examples that stand out to you as an example of the sort of mateship that you experienced that helped get you through?
Look, I don't think there was really any particular incident, because it was a continuing thing all the time that we were doing. Little things, of course. It wasn't, little things, I suppose, but there were quite a lot of cases where a fellow was too sick to eat his measly little bit of rice, and he'd insist on giving it to his mate, just something else. And his mate would probably say to him, for goodness sake, don't give that to me, that's yours, and you eat it, you're not well. It's the little household incidents like that, I think, are involved.
Did you find also, I guess, just as a part of a thing that got you through all of those times, did it come down to, I guess, an aspect of faith for you, or do you think you were just lucky?
Lucky. I think I've said that in a lot of us over and over again. People have often said to any of us that got home, and reasonably well. You must have been strong, you must have been in good nick and so on. Yeah, up on that railway was a matter, and I gave a perfect example of it just then. You had to be lucky. If you got cholera, you died. Or 99% of you, if you got cholera. Or if you retaliated to the Jap, you could die quite easily. And no, I think there were several things. You had to be lucky, basically. And the other thing too, you were fortunate if you could take a day-to-day attitude. I could. I was lucky, I reckon. I think that's part of being lucky too. Some people could, some people couldn't. And I could forget yesterday and not worry about tomorrow. Take one day at a time. There were plenty of examples of fellows who couldn't take that attitude. They weren't weak or anything. I often feel that they were strong. I wouldn't have been game to do what they did, but they decided they'd had enough. Turned up their toes, and they did. And there were plenty of examples of that. There was a chap, Noel Chitty, in my unit, a corporal. He was a 35-year-old bachelor from Melbourne. Did a wonderful job, helped people on the railway and so on. And he was lying down on this miserable night, wet night, after we'd been working 14 hours that day. And he just quietly said, "I've had enough." And we abused him. We used to abuse them if they said that for a start, you know, and called him all sorts of names. But he decided he had enough. And I can remember him saying, "I haven't got anyone to worry about at home. I haven't got a wife or children." He was found out afterwards his family owned a big timber business. He was a real playboy, and but a fine soldier and a fine bloke, and my God, he was dead in the morning. And so, but I wouldn't be game to do that.
What did you know about what was going on in the rest of the war?
While we were on Singapore Island, we were kept fairly up to date because we had our underground wireless sets. I mentioned to you that we had two men from my unit, Barry Arthur and Nelson Arthur, two brothers who were wireless experts, and they risked their lives for 3 years and 8 months hiding, moving that wireless from spot to spot in Changi, and they knew, and we knew, that if they were caught with it, they would be executed. There was no doubt about it. Unfortunately, since you were here, would it be 2 months ago you were here?
Nearly, yeah.
Yeah, a little over. Both of them have died. Since you were, I told you about them when you were here. Nelson died first, and Barry died a fortnight ago. Anyway, they're both in their own, and they both risked their lives. The way it was organised, and it had to be organised this way, was they moved that wireless constantly in one spot, and then they passed the news on to some person that Blackjack Gallagher organised. They changed men too on that, and they'd repeat the news to them, and then it was then decided how far down the line. Sometimes, depending on how things were in Changi and what was happening, it wasn't passed around at all. It was only passed to the top men, kept quiet, and they then. But when it was passed around, it was probably passed to whoever was in charge of, say, the house that my group were in at the first thing there, and then that person who was in charge then would quietly say, "Oh, well, there's been a landing at Dunkirk, or there's been this, or there's been that." So it was controlled in that way. While we were in Changi, that was kept up to date. I had the interesting experience of keeping it, or having a hand in keeping it up to date on our last working party. And there, there were 500 of us under Freddie Stahl, under Captain Stahl, and he knew I had or thought I had a pretty good memory, and I did then. And the arrangement was made then that a truck came out from Changi out to Bukit Panjang, which is a suburb of there where we were digging these tunnels into the hills in this last working party. And whoever brought the truck out with some supplies on it used to, in the latter part, when I was involved, used to meet me at a certain spot where I was working for the Japs, and we'd get away on our own down to the latrine area, get away on our own, and he would repeat just the headlines that he had, and my job was to take those headlines back to Captain Stahl, and then he would decide who would have them. So yes, so on the railway, no news.
What would the Japanese tell you about what was going on in the war?
They wouldn't tell us much except that it was boom boom, the Sydney Harbour Bridge had gone, and they'd tell us Alice Springs had gone, and all sorts of stupid things, because our fellas used to joke with them, that boom boom, the Harbour Bridge, and so we'd tell them anything. And but we'd get news, working parties working on Singapore Island. They'd sidle up to a Chinese, they'd give them a bit of... So it was, and lots of it were just, as I said earlier, furfies. They were, I mean, it all became so exaggerated in those unofficial ones, not in the official ones. So news was attempted to be got in all sorts of places. In Borneo, my neighbour here, as I told you before, was in Borneo, and they used to get it there from underground Chinese. The Chinese were great with us in every way, and so some news was got quite genuinely, but some was furfies and so on. But naturally, you were hungry for news all the time. The Japanese printed what they call the Sionan Times, because they didn't call it Singapore, they called it Sionan. And they printed an English version of that because of all the people who spoke English. And even though all their news was naturally sidelined for them, like good for things good that were happening, but you could tell, if they talked about a battle of the Coral Sea, you knew it was away down there, and then it got to a stage where they even had to put in their news that they had left Okinawa or they'd left somewhere else. So, and then, of course, up in Japan, the news started to come through to the parties in Japan from all sorts of sources. So, but there were quite a number of underground wireless sets. Sometimes they only lasted for a month or so, but they got enough to keep them going. The thing I believe that Barry Arthur used to tell us about, they had to be very careful. We had this concert party in Singapore, in Changi, and they had to be very careful. They used to... Barry Arthur, by the way, was a very nice singer and a bit of a musician himself. And he once he told me that once he heard Vera Lynn singing something that they'd never heard before, and he memorised how to sing it. And he was apparently talking to the chap in charge of the concert party and started to tell him, hear this, and they were going to put it on. They suddenly realised that the Japs might have been listening to was something that had never been heard before. They'd know that we'd got it on the set. But the news, we were all naturally, one of the things we were absolutely hungry for was news.
Can you tell me, Jim, I guess a very significant piece of news would have been when you heard that the war was at an end?
Well, the thing passed on to us See, I mentioned I was at Bukit Panjang, which there's this area. The Japs at that stage had taken all, mostly the fit men, certainly some of them are building the railway, of course, building the aerodrome which is now Changi, but they had other working parties to building defence stuff, which we shouldn't have been doing, but there was no choice. And the group I went with Fred Starr, we were sent out to Bukit Panjang, which was obviously on an area that they felt the Allies' invasion. They knew there would be an Allies' invasion because there'd been an invasion of Borneo, and they'd got news there. They'd have a pretty shrewd idea that Singapore was actually to be one of the next on the list after Borneo. They were going to put a parachute group into Changi Drone to look after that. But out where we were, I don't think there were any parachute fellas dropping in on us. Anyhow, this particular day, the first of anything came in that type of news. We knew how well we were doing in Borneo. We were seeing Allied planes coming over Singapore that were just twin-engine planes, and obviously came from Borneo. So we were on the uppity that things were on the move. Also beginning to wonder what was going to happen to us if the landing took place. And as we found out later, was found out, of course, if it had taken place, we were to be executed, and that was it. Everybody was to be executed. The final executions would have taken place in Japan if there'd been no landing in Japan. That's part of history now, so that's it. But anyhow, when I met this fellow, he said, look, all I can tell you has been, and I think, I'm only thinking now, it's 50 odd years ago, but what he meant was that there'd been an enormous explosions in Japan. That would have been the surrender in Japan was the 15th of August. 15th of August. So that would have probably been about the 10th, I'd say, because there was about a 5-day gap between that and what finally happened to me. All that he got over to me, there had been enormous explosions. Nobody knew what an atom bomb was or anything else. They just talked about these big explosions. And then I took this back to Fred Stahl, and the Japanese also were edgy. We were noticing they were very edgy. And Stahl, in his wisdom, said, look, what we'll do, we'll just tell them that the war's going well, that there's been another advance or two, see what happens in the next day or two. So probably the next day, it might have been 2 days, but I think the next bit of news was that there'd been a second big explosion. Well, that was Nagasaki, and so it was little bits and pieces like that. And then came the 15th, and the Chinese, we used to march, where I had to go, we used to have to go about 3 kilometres to where I was getting this news. There was a sawmill there, and where I told you before, where they were getting the timber to use in the tunnels where our mate had been killed, as you know, when the tunnel went in. Anyhow, probably, and I've got to be honest, I haven't got a clear memory because there was so much happening, and so edginess on was the Chinese giving the V for Victory sign. That began to really, they were doing it and getting away with it as our guards were going us down the road. The 16th, the next day, we were just sent out to work as though nothing had happened again. And Then news came through, and I was told, or it may have come from Chinese. It was this way that the Emperor of Japan had agreed for a surrender, but we weren't told, and Stahl wasn't told by the Japanese. We had a Sergeant Major Japanese in charge of the camp, wasn't told anything, but after that second day or two after the news that the surrender was on, we weren't sent to work. And then I think the day afterwards, and the Chinese had got some news into us that the Japanese Major General allegedly in charge of the troops on the island, and they had an enormous number. It was well over, because they knew Japan was going to have had proclaimed that he would not surrender, he would fight on. So that was naturally a pretty edgy time. But what we heard later was that Mountbatten had arranged for I think a nephew of the Emperor of Japan, who was a Major General in Saigon. And I think you've read this in books. But he did a very masterly thing. He arranged for him to be flown down to take that message down to the man. And again, allegedly, we heard that the Major General took the order and then committed suicide. Harikari on the drone where the order was taken. So, but all that is sort of hearsay. I've never been able to get hold of a book that has followed that part of it about Mountbatten and that right through. But I know I'm sure that's where what occurred. So, well, we were there then for 4 or 5 days, and then the chap in charge came to and told him that an agreement had been reached. No, not a surrender. He just wouldn't use the word surrender. Then that an agreement had been reached between the two armies and so on, that the war would cease. Then I think the guards disappeared then. The few guards we had, the whole lot disappeared. And then a truck arrived out, which would have been probably the 15th, probably about the 20th. Arrived out from Changi to load us, trucks, not a truck, to load us aboard. And Fred Stahl had somebody working on an Australian flag that was produced and flown from a truck when we went back to Changi.